The roaring 20s were a boom time for the auto industry, right up until Black Tuesday. As I mentioned in my last video, Ford's climb just kept going up and up and up and up until it peaked at 1.8 million units in 1923. The decline from there wasn't a gradual decline, it was more of a downward spiral, and Chevrolet sales were going up at almost the exact same rate that Ford sales were going down. And within a couple of years, they'd passed each other. The thing that stopped Ford's decline was finally introducing a new model. All new model for 1928, the new Model A. Not to be mistaken with the original Model A of 1903, this new A is sometimes referred to as Edsel A in reference to Henry's son, Edsel Ford. And with the beginning of this new Ford began one of the longest, most bitter rivalries in industry history. If we go back to the beginning of the decade, we also see the rise of a couple other things. One is the 3 P's of prestige: Peerless, Pierce Arrow, and Packard. Packard being the most significant, as starting in 1920 it became America's best-selling luxury brand. And it's a title that it held on to decades to come. Their slogan was, "Ask the man who owns one." With the rise of prestige vehicles, you also saw a rise of coach builders. Coach builders like Fleetwood, LeBaron, Fisher, Darren, Bowman and Schwartz. A coach builder was sort of like a tuner is now. They didn't actually build cars of their own. They bought chassis from other companies and restyled them, or styled them, as often they didn't have bodies on them to begin with. These were typically custom order. They were typically very expensive. And you'll see cars of this period and later that'll say, 1936 Packard by Darren, or something similar to that to say that this was a coach-built car. And they are, for the most part, unique, although many coach builders would have like styles you could choose from, but they'd still build them custom. Another thing that happened in the 1920s was the Alfred Sloan restructuring of General Motors. Alfred Sloan basically looked at the American automotive market and sliced it up into price segments, and then assigned a brand for each one of those segments. Unfortunately, he sliced it up into more segments than GM had brands, so that meant creating some new brands. The first of which was Pontiac, which was a down-market version of the Oakland to fill that gap between Oakland and Chevrolet. And towards the end of the decade, we also got LaSalle, which was a down-market Cadillac. But it was more than just a down-market Cadillac, because the first LaSalle was also the first car to use General Motors' color and design studio, their attempt to do sort of an in-house coach building kind of a styling thing. Later, they'd also introduce an upmarket version of the Buick called the Marquis, and an upmarket version of the Oldsmobile called the Viking, but neither one of those lasted. Because these weren't all new divisions, they were called companion makes. Typically, they shared dealerships with the brand that they were based on and were sold alongside them, and also shared many components. A lot of times, Geo is considered a companion make because it was sold alongside Chevrolet at Chevrolet dealerships, but really none of the vehicles had anything in common with the Chevrolet vehicles, other than those same vehicles that were imported into Geo had been called Chevrolets the years before that. It was also during this time that we saw a standardization of automobile controls. Early vehicles, the controls were however the designer wanted to set them up. Each vehicle could be completely different, and a lot of times there was nothing intuitive about it. Basically, you almost had to take a class on how to drive each individual vehicle, which obviously was a problem for a lot of people. And as vehicles got more popular, the need to have standardized controls became more of a necessity. Now, the general layout that was adapted was first used by Cadillac, but really it was Austin in Europe that had made that layout popular. We also have to take note of the rise of Chrysler. Now, Walter Chrysler made a name for himself as the president of Buick, and he was basically the man that made Buick the success it was. When he left GM, he was called the highest paid man in the auto industry. From there, he went to save Willys from bankruptcy, and then he took over the struggling Maxwell Chalmers company and reorganized it to what would become Chrysler. He then created two spin-off divisions, one that was Plymouth, that was aimed specifically at competing with Ford and Chevrolet. He chose the name Plymouth because he wanted it to sound American. Then he created the DeSoto brand to split the gap between Chrysler and Plymouth, and it was named after the Explorer. Shortly after the creation of Chrysler, the Dodge brothers both died within a close span of each other, and the Dodge Brothers Company came up for sale. Walter Chrysler jumped on it. That created a little bit of internal conflict because Dodge and DeSoto were essentially in the same segment, and they leapfrogged each other a couple of times through the decades, but eventually DeSoto would become a budget version of the Chryslers. It was also during this time that Ford took over the failing Lincoln Company, named for Abraham Lincoln and created by Henry Leland, who had taken over the Henry Ford Company that had become Cadillac, which he left to adapt Cadillac engines for aircraft use during the Second World War, and then became Ford's luxury company. So by the time we reached the end of the decade, we had a booming economy. Car companies were expanding every which way and selling cars at what we now seem to be low prices, but were being financed. And a lot of times the banks weren't doing a lot of, credit checking before financing these, and they were financing everything. And of course, this all came crashing down on the infamous Black Tuesday stock market crash. And the roaring 20s ended with, a crash. And sales declined for everyone. But really, by the end of this decade, most of the American brands that we're familiar with today were fully established. GM had Chevy, Pontiac, Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, Ford and Lincoln, Dodge, Chrysler, Plymouth, DeSoto was there. And then you had a lot of the more popular independent brands. Hudson, Nash, Studebaker, Willys. So it was about this point that the American automotive market, as a lot of us see it, came about.